Welcome to Manchac United Methodist Church's Facebook Live page. I'm David McNitsky. I'm one of the pastors, and it's my privilege to present to you the first of what we call Nourishment at Noon segments. We'll be here at noon, Monday through Friday for the foreseeable future. Now, we call this nourishment, but I have to tell you, we're going to start with a little junk food this afternoon, and that is I want to take you on a very brief tour of my office. Now, I'm working from home, so this is my home office, and I do that for a couple of reasons. Number one is to remind you that if at all possible, please try to stay home and do the work that you can do from there. But secondly, I do this because most of you who have seen my office at the church have not seen the things I'm going to show you in a moment. So let me first show you some things that you won't see in my office. Because my wife, when we moved from San Antonio to Austin, declared that my office would be what she called a Duke-free zone. So all of my Duke stuff had to be allowed to go at work, and so it's here at my home office. So I want to show you a few of the things that are in my home office. First, though, let me show you this. I do have with me a Bible in my home office, just so you know I'm not going to make any of this stuff up. In my home office, I also have a book on the parables. Now, this is a shame that we are going to have my parable class by Zoom tomorrow from 9:30 to 10:10, and you can find out more information in the church's weekly e-newsletter. But of course, is I want to make sure that you know it's here. It's first of all, this is the Duke football coach, Coach Cut, and he is always in my home office. I also want to, this is a trigger warning, it will probably bother some of you, but this is Coach K, the Duke basketball coach, and he is always looking over my shoulder here in the office. And then finally, I have the Duke Blue Devil himself. We had some friends who are 4-year-old triplets who were visiting a while back, and they asked me, now, which superhero is he? Well, I was tempted, but I had to admit that he wasn't really a superhero. So that's a little bit of a tour from my office, but one of the reasons I wanted to tell you that is that it reminds me of my first lessons as a young adult in social distancing. I went to school at Duke in Durham, North Carolina, and I attended church. And the church was in Durham, and it was about 15 minutes from the Duke campus, about 25 minutes from the North Carolina State campus, and about 20 minutes from the University of North Carolina Chapel Hills campus. And one of the things I learned right away was on Sunday mornings during football season, attendance tended to go down after the game. And what I found out was if your team lost, you tended not to show up at church the next morning. And that puzzled me. But I began to realize that it was a form of social distancing. Well, number one, I think it was a sense of shame. They were embarrassed that their team and their school had not competed successfully on the day before. And I know that social distancing has been around even since biblical days. It reminds me of the woman at the well who had to distance herself out of a sense of shame. So she went to the well at noontime and not at the main times people went to get water. I think sometimes people there in Durham would social distance themselves on Sunday morning out of a sense of fear, which is, oh boy, if I show up and I'm going to hear it from all the other fans of the other schools. And so not wanting to hear that, they would tend to stay home. And that's before you could, of course, live stream and worship from home. Now, I see that in the Bible as well. The story of the Good Samaritan. Remember the Levite and the priest who walk around a wounded man who may in fact be dead? One of the reasons they walk around him is they're afraid. It could actually be a plant. That it may be a ruse and somebody's hiding nearby, and if they stop to tend to this wounded man, someone may jump out of the shrubs and attack them. Some people, though, in my church in Durham didn't social distance out of fear or shame, but there was more a sense of purity, that even though their school had lost and they were perhaps a little embarrassed, They wanted to remain true to who they were, so they weren't going to associate with people from other schools that day. They didn't want to be infected, in a sense, with those other schools. And you can see purity in the Bible concerns. That's why Zacchaeus climbs the tree. It's not just because he's short, though he might be. But the real reason is nobody's going to let him up front to look, because nobody wants him to touch him or be touched by him, and they don't want him to touch them, and they don't want to touch him, so he's got to climb up the tree. He's distancing out of a sense of the purity that other people have. And then finally, some people would social distance, I suppose, out of health concerns, which of course is what we had today. Now, I didn't have health concerns at my church in Durham, North Carolina, nor did I think anybody else had them. They weren't worried about being infected when they went to worship with somebody there on Sunday morning. I do remember that my last year at Duke, North Carolina, University of North Carolina's football team had an ad campaign to draw people to their stadium, and they called it Carolina Fever, Catch It. Well, I was never worrying about catching it because as a Duke guy, I was pretty well inoculated. But do you know that biblically health concerns were a huge part of social distancing? And in fact, the key example of this are lepers. Lepers had to keep a distance from other people so that those other people would not catch the dreaded disease of leprosy. And that leads me into the brief message I want to share with you today from Luke 17. It's a story of Jesus and 10 lepers. There are Jewish and Samaritan lepers, together 10 of them, and they see Jesus walking by the road, and they call out from a distance, "Jesus, have mercy on us." Well, first of all, note that they're at a distance because lepers always lived outside of town. They depended on charity, that people would come and drop on their porch and then run away quickly. And if they actually saw someone who was coming to near them, they would have to wave their arms and go, "Unclean, unclean." Understand the risk that was involved in getting close to a leper. They were wounded physically by the disease. They were wounded emotionally by loneliness. And they were wounded spiritually because they weren't welcome into worship in the temple with other people and in other worship gatherings because of their disease. And so these 10 lepers call out to Jesus, and Jesus stops and responds to them. And there are two things I want to note about that today. One is, it's interesting to me that Jews and Samaritans, who ordinarily don't touch each other or have anything to do with each other, are together, and what brings them together is their woundedness. Our common pain, our common problems sometimes can join us together in ways that other things cannot. I remember Brene Brown writing in Braving the Wilderness how important it is to combat loneliness in our world by participating in as many experiences of communal joy and communal pain that we can be a part of. It's good for us to be joined together in sorrow and to be joined together in joy. I'm certainly prayerful that our political parties and our theological different camps will come together, and that we'll come together all over the world in this coronavirus, because it's not an American problem or a Chinese problem or an Italian problem. It's for all of us, and only together will we get through. And so the Jews and Samaritans bond over this common pain. And of course, the most important part is that they call out to Jesus from a distance, but Jesus doesn't need to be at a distance. He's not afraid of catching what they have. And so he has many times in the Gospels overcome social distance to someone who was bleeding, to someone who had leprosy, to someone who had been shunned by the community or caught even in the act of adultery. He always crosses over. And why does he do that? For two main reasons, I believe. Number one, because Jesus cares. I'm reminded of a story the late John Claypool told about being in college his freshman year. And the very first Sunday at college back then, this many years ago, students dressed up at this Baptist college and they went to church on Sunday and came back and ate in the school commons or cafeteria. But as a freshman, he knew no one, and he ended up eating alone. An upperclassman saw him and said, "Come eat at my table." And then the upperclassman continued to check on him. And finally, he said to the upperclassman, "Why is it you include me?" And the upperclassman's response was words I will never forget. He said this to John, the freshman. He said, "I want you to know that what happens to you matters to me." And what happens in our life matters to Jesus. And diseases and sins and even doubt, nothing is going to separate us from his love. Jesus always knew that love was greater than any problem, that love was greater than any disease, that love was always greater than fear. And there's another reason why Jesus is able to respond, and that's quite frankly this. Jesus is a reverse infection. Jesus isn't worried about catching what we have. Jesus is more interested in us catching what he has to give us. Jesus never got leprosy. Jesus was never put in a place where he was too unclean to worship or to pray. Jesus' infection always went in reverse. What he had to give, people could receive from him what he might catch from them. The power of Jesus is our power even today, and that's the power of love. It's what we have to give. We can do it over the phone, by email, by text. We can do it 6 feet apart, but it is our power to overcome those things that separate us. And so I would remind you in these days that there is no problem that love cannot greatly improve, if not completely reverse. So I invite you to appropriately practice love with those around you and apply love in situations that has become perhaps difficult and you think that they're unhealable, that the wound will never heal, that this infection will never get better. Know that love has the power, as Jesus has the power, to make that difference. And so I hope as we continue to look at the lepers this week, we'll learn not only about the power of love, but we'll learn about some other powers that we'll look at again on Wednesday when we come back to the story. But until then, I want you to remember this. You may be stuck at home, but it does not mean that you cannot take a journey. God bless you.